Dr. Sandra Schneider is of the Jesuit School in Berkeley and a sister in the Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. A joy to have you. Now, we're going to talk in this segment about religious life, and when we were off camera, you said, well, the religious life really goes back to the first century. Let's skip, say, the first 17 centuries of that, and take us to Western Europe and what happens with immigration into the United States and how that affects the sisters and the images that people have.
All right. Go back a little bit further than that. In the 1600s, 1700s, for the first time, actually a little bit before that, but in any significant way, sisters who were nuns, who were cloistered, who entered their religious communities, and the way Carmelites are today, for example, did not come out, did not have external ministries, okay? And that was pretty much the type of religious life that you had in Europe in the 1700s and so on. As the United States, or what became the United States, when it was discovered, it was largely populated, as we know, by people coming first from England. So basically, Anglicans and Protestants, who were the first citizens or the first dwellers in this country. And some sisters from these largely cloistered orders came to the United States to help evangelize, as it were, the indigenous people who were here. But what happened from about 1830 until the middle of the 1900s was huge waves of immigration, as we know, came into this country and settled really all the way across the country, from the eastern seaboard all the way across. Many of those new immigrants were from traditionally Catholic countries, so from France and Germany, and then eventually from Eastern European countries like Poland. And they settled in this country, what became the United States. But they were in a very, in many cases, unhospitable climate, a very Protestant environment. And one of the things that sisters became very involved in, because the church wanted them to be very involved in it, was helping to preserve the faith of Catholics in this country. And so what most people alive today can remember is kind of Catholic ghettos. That is the Catholic church, the Catholic school, and the sisters teaching in the school or nursing in a nearby hospital. And basically the Catholics having their whole life within that context, except for the father's work position. But so they went to school with Catholics, they grew up with Catholics, they married Catholics, they had Catholic children until they were buried in Catholic cemeteries. That largely, so that created a kind of culture of its own, a kind of ghetto culture. Kind of symbolically in 1960 with the election of John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic, only Catholic president, you began to have, under the influence of Vatican II, a kind of cracking open of that ghetto. So Catholic children began going to school in public schools and so on. You began to have intermarriage between Catholics and Protestants, and even racial intermarriage and so on. And so that changed the role that sisters had rather drastically. And
well, the sisters then from 1830 and coming on, you were running hospitals and schools
social service.
And so you were always there, being very helpful and all of this stuff, and now you're beginning to describe how this is changing.
Right. So we were, for example, when I entered, all IHMs of my order would be living in a convent with other IHMs, and we'd be dressed in our traditional habits down to the floor, our veils and so on. So we'd be very recognizable, basically traveled in groups, or at least in twos, and didn't travel very much at all. So we lived in the convent, we taught in the school, and we took part in that cultural milieu of the Catholic parish community type of thing. What happened with Vatican II, of course, was the church changed its whole approach to culture, that rather than trying to back off and protect ourselves from contamination by other religions, the culture, and so on, the council called the church to go into the culture, to go into the world, to preach the gospel to every creature, as Jesus said. So our focus, instead of being this way, became more this way. And that's when you begin to have many sisters doing things that most people don't associate with sisters. For example, most would not associate a sister with the kind of position that I hold, being the only member of my community in California teaching in a graduate school.
So what strikes me there is we, outside, have an image of what sisters and nuns are. And they're in the Eloise book and travel in blacks and whites and around here.
Right.
And so and then I think on the next segment we'll get into those internal changes from Vatican II. But there's also the outside view. I still remember 10 years ago we had a Presbyterian General Assembly in Milwaukee. And I met this fellow, and very nice fellow, and we went out to lunch together, and at the end of the lunch he said, you know, this is fascinating. You're the first Protestant I have ever really sat and talked to in my life. Going back to the enclaves, and I think when we come back we're going to talk about what happens when those enclaves break down, and for the sisters, the nuns, what is happening now. With Senator M. Snyder's Hugh Burrows. We'll be right back.